The small town of Millfield was the kind of place where time moved a little slower. Its streets were lined with aging storefronts, the occasional American flag fluttering in the breeze, and a single diner that served as the social hub for its tight-knit community. On any given weekend morning, you could find farmers in muddy boots, shop owners taking a break, and families enjoying stacks of pancakes drenched in syrup. Life here was predictable, safe, and deeply connected to the land. Jack Turner sat in his usual corner booth, nursing a black coffee as he gazed out the window at the golden fields stretching into the horizon. Jack had only been home for a week, but his return had stirred a quiet curiosity among the locals. After all, he wasn't just any farmer's son. Jack had spent the last decade serving in the U.S. Navy, though few people knew the specifics. Jack wasn't one to brag, and his reserved demeanor ensured that most only knew the bare minimum. He had been deployed overseas multiple times, and now, he was back. At 32, Jack looked like he belonged in Millfield. His jeans were worn, his flannel shirt fit loosely over his broad shoulders, and his calloused hands hinted at a life spent working the land. But there was an intensity in his eyes that set him apart, a quiet vigilance that came from years of training and surviving situations most couldn't fathom. He was home to help his aging parents with the farm and, he hoped, to find some peace away from the chaos of his military past. The door to the diner swung open, and a wave of raucous laughter filled the room. A group of bikers strolled in, their leather jackets emblazoned with patches and slogans that proclaimed their allegiance to some regional motorcycle club. They were outsiders in Millfield, a stark contrast to the understated locals. Their arrival was met with a mix of unease and annoyance. Most of the diners glanced at them briefly before returning to their meals, hoping to avoid any confrontation. Jack's eyes flicked to the group, his expression unreadable. He'd seen men like them before, loud, brash, and often more bark than bite. But he also knew better than to underestimate anyone. He returned his gaze to his coffee, trying to tune out their voices. The bikers, however, weren't the type to go unnoticed. They swaggered to the counter, their voices carrying as they ordered breakfast. Their leader, a burly man with a thick beard and a loud voice, scanned the room as if he owned it. His eyes landed on Jack, and a smirk spread across his face. "Hey, country boy," the man called out, his tone mocking. "What's a hard-working farmer like you doing sitting around? Shouldn't you be out milking cows or something?" Jack didn't look up, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He'd heard worse, and he wasn't about to take the bait. But the biker wasn't done. "Too busy sipping your fancy coffee, huh? Let me guess, you think you're better than us," the man continued, his friends laughing on cue. Jack finally raised his eyes, meeting the man's gaze with a calm intensity that made the biker falter for a moment. "Just enjoying my morning," Jack said evenly. "Same as you." The response wasn't what the biker had expected. He was used to people either snapping back or cowering, but Jack's measured tone threw him off. Determined not to lose face, he stepped closer to Jack's table, towering over him. "What's that on your cap?" the biker asked, pointing to the baseball cap Jack wore. The small Navy SEAL trident embroidered on the side was subtle, but it caught the man's attention. "You some kind of soldier?" Jack took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Something like that." The biker laughed, a harsh sound that filled the diner. "Yeah, right. A SEAL? You don't look like one of those tough guys. Bet you bought that hat online to impress the ladies." The other bikers chuckled, egging their leader on. The other diners watched nervously, their discomfort palpable. Jack remained seated, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He set his coffee down slowly and leaned back in his seat, studying the man in front of him. "Maybe you're right," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "Maybe I'm just a guy with a hat." The biker took this as confirmation and leaned in closer. "That's what I thought. All talk, no action." The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, waiting to see how he would respond. He knew he could end this with a single move, but he also knew that violence wasn't the answer, not here, not now. Instead, he let the silence hang, forcing the biker to fill it. "Tell you what," the biker said, clearly enjoying the attention. "Why don't you show us what you're made of? Or are you too scared?" Jack's eyes didn't waver. What exactly would that prove? The question caught the biker off guard. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss. Jack's calm demeanor was unnerving, and it was starting to chip away at the man's bravado. Sensing this, the biker resorted to the only tactic he knew, escalation. He reached out and snatched Jack's cap off his head, holding it up like a trophy. "Let's see if this thing is real," he said, turning it over in his hands. The room fell silent. Jack stood up slowly, his full height and broad frame suddenly making him seem much larger than he had appeared sitting down. The biker hesitated, the cap still in his hand. Jack took a single step forward, closing the distance between them. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge that sent a shiver down the biker's spine. "I'd like my hat back," Jack said simply. For a moment, the biker seemed to consider his options. He could feel the eyes of his friends and the diner's patrons on him, waiting to see what he would do. The bravado that had fueled him earlier was slipping away, replaced by a growing unease. Something about Jack's presence, his stillness, his unflinching gaze, made it clear that this wasn't a man to be trifled with. The biker forced a laugh, trying to mask his discomfort. "Fine," he said, tossing the cap back to Jack. "Didn't mean to hurt your feelings." Jack caught the hat effortlessly and placed it back on his head. "No harm done," he said, his tone neutral. The biker stepped back, muttering something under his breath as he rejoined his group. The tension in the room eased slightly, but the other patrons still watched Jack with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Jack returned to his seat, picked up his coffee, and resumed his quiet observation of the world outside the window. As the bikers left the diner a few minutes later, their leader shot Jack a final glance, his expression a mix of frustration and grudging respect. Jack didn't acknowledge him. He didn't need to. The message had been sent loud and clear: strength wasn't about loud words or flashy displays. It was about control, discipline, and knowing when to act, and when not to. The incident was over, but for Jack, it was just another reminder that life in Millfield might be quieter than his years as a Navy SEAL, but it wasn't without its own challenges. And while he didn't seek out conflict, he wasn't about to back down when it came knocking. Jack Turner wasn't someone who liked to dwell on moments like the one in the diner. For him, it was just another example of the type of confrontation he'd seen countless times before, someone eager to prove themselves, to assert their dominance, and ultimately backing down when faced with calm, unwavering resolve. Yet, as he walked back to his family's farmhouse that afternoon, the encounter lingered in his mind, not because it shook him, but because it reminded him of the delicate balance between his past and the quiet life he was trying to embrace. Millfield was the town Jack had grown up in, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. As a boy, he'd spent countless hours working alongside his father, learning the rhythms of farming life, the long days, the unpredictability of weather, the quiet satisfaction of seeing crops grow under the sun. It was a hard life but an honest one, and Jack respected it deeply. But there had always been a part of him that yearned for something more, something that would take him beyond the boundaries of this small town. That yearning had led him to the Navy. Jack still remembered the day he'd told his parents he was enlisting. His father had been silent, his face a mix of pride and concern, while his mother had fought back tears, asking him why he couldn't just stay and take over the farm. Jack didn't have an easy answer for her, only the conviction that this was what he needed to do. He'd been 22 then, restless and eager to prove himself, though he couldn't have known just how much the decision would shape the man he would become. Becoming a Navy SEAL was a grueling process, both physically and mentally. The training pushed Jack to his limits, forcing him to confront fears and doubts he hadn't even known he had. There were moments when he wanted to quit, when the weight of the challenge felt unbearable. But each time, he found a reason to keep going, whether it was the memory of his father's steady determination in the face of a failing harvest or the quiet faith his mother had placed in him, even as she feared for his safety. Jack's years in the SEALs had taken him to places he could never have imagined as a boy in Millfield. He'd seen the worst of humanity and the best, often within the same breath. He'd learned to make split-second decisions under pressure, to lead when others faltered, and to trust his instincts. Yet, for all the skills he'd gained, there had also been a cost. The things he'd seen and done were not easily left behind, and there were nights when the weight of it all threatened to pull him under. That was part of the reason he'd come home. After years of deployments, Jack had decided it was time to reconnect with the simpler life he'd left behind. His parents were older now, and the farm needed extra hands. Jack saw it as an opportunity not only to help them but also to find a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. But as much as he wanted to leave his past behind, he couldn't ignore that it was still a part of him, shaping how he moved through the world. The bikers, for example. Jack had dealt with men like them before, both in the military and outside it. He knew their type, the posturing, the need to appear tough, the way they fed off the fear and submission of others. In the SEALs, he'd been trained to see through such facades, to assess threats with precision and act accordingly. That training had become second nature, guiding him even in situations as seemingly mundane as a diner confrontation. What Jack hadn't expected was how quickly word of the incident would spread. By the time he reached the farm, his parents were already waiting for him on the porch, their expressions a mix of worry and curiosity. His mother, a petite woman with silver-streaked hair, was the first to speak. "Jack, we heard about what happened at the diner," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mom," Jack replied, brushing off her worry with a small smile. It wasn't a big deal. His father, a man of few words, studied him for a moment before nodding. "Those bikers have been causing trouble in town for a while now. Guess they didn't know who they were messing with." Jack shrugged. "It's over. They were just looking for someone to pick on." But Jack knew it wasn't entirely over. Men like the bikers didn't take kindly to being embarrassed, and he had a feeling they wouldn't let the incident go without some attempt to save face. Sure enough, as the week went on, he began to notice signs that the bikers were trying to reassert their dominance in Millfield. Reports of them harassing shop owners, revving their engines late at night near residential areas, and intimidating locals at the gas station began to circulate. Jack kept his head down, focusing on the farm work and trying to stay out of it. But the tension in the town was palpable, and it was clear that many of the locals were growing increasingly uneasy. For years, the bikers had been a nuisance, but now their behavior was escalating, fueled by their bruised egos. Jack couldn't ignore the situation forever, especially when he started hearing stories of the bikers targeting the diner again, where the confrontation had taken place. One evening, Jack was in the barn repairing a piece of equipment when his old friend Pete showed up. Pete was a mechanic who owned the town's auto repair shop, and he'd been one of Jack's closest friends growing up. The two hadn't seen much of each other since Jack's return, but tonight Pete seemed determined to catch up. "Hey, Jack," Pete said, leaning against the barn door. "Got a minute?" "Sure," Jack replied, setting down his tools. "What's up?" Pete hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure they were alone. "Listen, I know you've been trying to keep a low profile, but I thought you should know, the bikers have been asking about you. They've been hanging around my shop, trying to find out where you live." Jack frowned. "What do they want?" "Trouble, probably," Pete said with a shrug. "They're still sore about what happened at the diner. Word is, their leader, Red, wants to teach you a lesson." Jack sighed, his shoulders tensing. He'd hoped the bikers would let it go, but it seemed they were determined to make their presence known. "Thanks for letting me know, Pete," he said. "I'll keep an eye out." Pete nodded but didn't leave. "Jack, are you sure you're okay? I mean, I know you're a tough guy, but these guys don't fight fair. They're not like the people you dealt with in the Navy." Jack gave him a wry smile. "You'd be surprised how similar they are." Pete chuckled, but there was an edge of nervousness in his laughter. "Just be careful, all right? The town's been on edge since you got back, and I don't think anyone wants to see this get worse." Jack promised to be cautious, but as Pete drove away, he felt a knot of frustration tightening in his chest. He didn't want to be the center of attention, and he certainly didn't want to bring more trouble to Millfield. But he also couldn't ignore the fact that the bikers were creating a problem that wasn't going to go away on its own. That night, as he sat on the porch watching the stars, Jack thought about what he should do. He could confront the bikers directly, but that would only escalate things further. He could ignore them, but that would leave the town vulnerable to their intimidation. Neither option felt right, and Jack found himself wishing, not for the first time, that he could leave the conflict resolution to someone else. But deep down, he knew that wasn't who he was. Jack had spent his life facing challenges head-on, and he wasn't about to change now. If the bikers wanted to push him, he'd push back, but on his terms, not theirs. He just had to figure out how. The morning air in Millfield was crisp, carrying with it the scent of dew-laden grass and freshly turned soil. Jack Turner stood in the barn, his hands deftly tying a bale of hay as sunlight filtered through the wooden slats, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Despite the peaceful surroundings, his mind was far from calm. Pete's warning about the bikers lingered in his thoughts, a reminder that trouble wasn't just a memory from his time overseas, it had a way of finding him, even here. Jack's parents were still asleep when he slipped out of the house earlier that morning. He'd been restless all night, thinking about how to handle the growing tension in town. The bikers had made their move, now it was Jack's turn to decide whether to let things simmer or take action. He wasn't someone who sought conflict, but he also wasn't one to let bullies have their way, especially when it came to the people and town he cared about. As he finished stacking the hay bales, he heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel. Jack straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans as an old pickup truck rolled to a stop outside the barn. It was Sheriff Tom Grady, a man Jack had known since childhood. The sheriff climbed out of the truck, his weathered face marked by years of keeping the peace in a town that rarely tested his limits. "Mornin', Jack," Tom said, adjusting his hat as he approached. "Morning, Sheriff," Jack replied, extending a hand. "What brings you out here?" Tom shook Jack's hand firmly, then leaned against the barn door, his expression serious. "Heard you've been catching some attention around town. Thought it might be a good idea to check in." Jack nodded, leaning back against a haystack. "You mean the bikers?" "Exactly," Tom said with a sigh. "They've been stirring up trouble ever since they rolled into town, but things seem to have escalated since that little showdown at the diner. Word is they've got a grudge against you now." Jack crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "I didn't start anything, Sheriff. They came looking for a fight, and I didn't give it to them." Tom raised a hand, his tone placating. "I know that, Jack. You handled yourself better than most would've. But these guys aren't the type to let things go. They've been making noise about teaching you a lesson, and frankly, I'm worried about what that means for you, and for Millfield." Jack studied Tom for a moment, appreciating the man's honesty. The sheriff was right to be concerned. The bikers weren't just a nuisance anymore, they were a threat, one that needed to be addressed before things got out of hand. "What do you suggest, Sheriff?" Jack asked. "I'm not looking for trouble, but I'm not going to sit back and let them walk all over this town, either." Tom hesitated, clearly torn. "I don't want to see you take matters into your own hands, Jack. You've got a history, and while I respect what you've done for this country, I also know how quickly things can spiral out of control when people like them are involved. Let me handle it. We're keeping an eye on them, and if they cross the line, we'll deal with it legally. Jack appreciated Tom's commitment to doing things by the book, but he also knew the limits of small-town law enforcement. The bikers had already shown they didn't respect the rules, and Jack doubted they'd be deterred by the threat of a slap on the wrist. "I hear you, Sheriff," Jack said carefully. "But you know as well as I do that these guys aren't going to stop until someone makes them." Tom sighed again, clearly frustrated. "Just promise me you'll be careful, Jack. Last thing I need is a situation that ends with you, or anyone else, getting hurt." Jack nodded, offering the sheriff a small, reassuring smile. "You've got my word." Satisfied for the moment, Tom tipped his hat and climbed back into his truck. As the vehicle disappeared down the driveway, Jack turned back to the barn, his mind already working through the problem at hand. He respected the sheriff's approach, but Jack had spent years dealing with situations where waiting for someone else to act wasn't an option. If the bikers wanted to escalate, Jack would be ready. Later that afternoon, Jack drove into town to pick up supplies. The streets were quiet, but there was an underlying tension that was hard to ignore. People glanced at him as he walked into the hardware store, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Jack wasn't one to revel in attention, but he understood why the town was on edge. The bikers had turned Millfield into a powder keg, and everyone was waiting to see who would light the match. As Jack loaded bags of feed into the bed of his truck, he spotted a group of kids playing in the park across the street. Their laughter was a stark contrast to the tension that hung over the town, a reminder of what was at stake. Jack had spent years protecting people he'd never met. Now, he found himself feeling the same sense of responsibility for the people in his own backyard. The thought hardened his resolve. If the bikers wanted a fight, Jack wasn't going to give them one on their terms. Instead, he'd use the skills he'd honed over a decade in the Navy to outsmart them, to protect Millfield without letting things descend into chaos. That evening, Jack began to put his plan into motion. He reached out to a few trusted friends in town, Pete, the mechanic, Sarah, who owned the diner, and Ben, a retired police officer who lived down the road. Together, they brainstormed ways to counter the bikers' intimidation tactics without resorting to violence. "We need to show them that this town isn't going to roll over," Jack said as the group gathered around his kitchen table. "But we also need to be smart about it. If we give them an excuse to escalate, they'll take it." Pete nodded, his face grim. "I can talk to some of the other business owners, make sure they're on board. If we all stand together, it'll be harder for the bikers to single anyone out." Sarah chimed in, her voice steady. "I'll start spreading the word at the diner. People need to know that we're not powerless, that we can push back without putting ourselves in danger." Ben, who had spent years dealing with tough situations as a cop, leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I've still got some connections in law enforcement. I can make a few calls, see if we can get some extra patrols out here. Might not be much, but it could help." Jack nodded, grateful for their support. "This is our town," he said, his voice firm. "We don't need to fight them to show them that. We just need to stand together." Over the next few days, the plan began to take shape. The townspeople came together, reinforcing each other's resolve and creating a united front against the bikers. They organized neighborhood watches, coordinated with local law enforcement, and made it clear that Millfield wasn't a place where intimidation would be tolerated. The bikers, sensing the shift in the town's attitude, began to back off, their bravado dampened by the growing resistance. But Jack knew the fight wasn't over. Men like them didn't give up easily, and he had a feeling their next move would be even bolder, and potentially more dangerous. As Jack prepared for what was to come, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the town he called home. Millfield wasn't perfect, but its people were strong, resourceful, and willing to stand up for what was right. Jack had spent years fighting for something bigger than himself, and now, he realized, he was doing the same thing here. The tension in Millfield was like a coiled spring, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Jack could feel it in every interaction, the way people hesitated before speaking, the nervous glances exchanged in the diner, and the way children were ushered inside before dusk. The united front the town had formed was holding strong, but everyone knew the bikers wouldn't let their bruised egos heal quietly. Jack had seen this kind of standoff before, one side refusing to back down, the other waiting for a moment of weakness to strike. Jack spent the early hours of the next morning tending to the farm, using the routine as a way to clear his mind. His hands worked methodically, mending fences and checking on livestock, but his thoughts remained sharp and focused. He'd spent enough time in the SEALs to know that preparation was the key to survival. The bikers would make their move soon, and Jack needed to be ready. By mid-morning, Jack's hunch proved correct. Pete called, his voice low and urgent. "They're here, Jack," Pete said. "The bikers. A bunch of them just rolled into town, more than usual. They're parked outside the diner, and it doesn't look like they're here for coffee." Jack tightened his grip on the phone. "How many?" "At least a dozen, maybe more," Pete replied. "Red's with them. They're being loud, throwing their weight around, but no one's done anything, yet." Jack's jaw clenched. Red was the leader of the group, a man with a reputation for being as calculating as he was ruthless. If he was in town, it meant this wasn't just about posturing anymore. They were escalating, and Jack knew he couldn't sit back and wait for things to boil over. "Thanks for letting me know, Pete," Jack said. "Keep an eye on things, but don't engage. I'll be there soon." Hanging up, Jack grabbed his keys and headed for his truck. He didn't tell his parents where he was going, they didn't need the added worry. As he drove toward town, Jack replayed everything he knew about the bikers, piecing together a strategy. He didn't want a fight, but he wasn't naive enough to think he could avoid one entirely. His goal was to defuse the situation, but if it came to it, he'd do whatever was necessary to protect the people of Millfield. When Jack arrived, the sight was exactly as Pete had described. The bikers' motorcycles were lined up like a wall of intimidation outside the diner, their engines rumbling ominously. Red stood at the center of the group, his burly frame and leather vest making him an imposing figure. The townspeople kept their distance, watching anxiously from windows and doorways. Jack parked his truck a block away, taking a moment to assess the scene before approaching. The bikers were laughing and shouting, their voices cutting through the quiet morning air like a warning. Red was leaning against his bike, a smug grin on his face as he surveyed the uneasy onlookers. Jack walked toward them with deliberate calm, his boots crunching on the gravel. He could feel the weight of the townspeople's eyes on him, their unspoken hope that he'd be able to put an end to this without making things worse. As he approached, the bikers turned their attention to him, their laughter fading into a tense silence. Well, Red said, pushing off his bike and taking a step toward Jack. "If it isn't the hero of the hour. I've been hearing a lot about you, farmer boy." Jack stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his gaze steady. "And I've been hearing a lot about you, Red. Seems like you've been busy." Red's grin widened, but there was no humor in it. "You could say that. See, my boys and I, we don't take kindly to being shown up. Especially not by someone who thinks they can hide behind a plow." The bikers chuckled, their voices a low rumble of menace. Jack didn't flinch. He'd faced far more dangerous men than Red and his crew, and he wasn't about to let their bluster get to him. "I'm not hiding behind anything," Jack said evenly. "But I don't think this town is big enough for the kind of trouble you're bringing. Why don't you pack up and move on?" Red's expression darkened, his grin fading. "You think you can tell us what to do? This isn't your battlefield, soldier. This is real life. And in real life, there's no one here to back you up." Jack allowed himself a small smile. "You'd be surprised." As if on cue, a group of townspeople began to emerge from their hiding spots, shop owners, farmers, and even a few teenagers who'd mustered the courage to stand with Jack. They weren't armed, but their presence sent a clear message: Millfield wasn't going to be bullied anymore. Red's eyes narrowed as he looked around, his bravado faltering for a moment. "Cute," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "You think a bunch of scared townsfolk are going to make us leave?" "No," Jack replied, his voice calm but firm. "I think you're going to make the smart choice and leave on your own." Red stepped closer, his face inches from Jack's. "And if we don't?" Jack held his ground, his voice low and steady. "Then you'll find out exactly what happens when you push people too far." For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, without warning, one of the bikers lunged forward, a sneer on his face as he aimed a punch at Jack. But Jack was faster. He sidestepped the attack with practiced ease, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back in one fluid motion. The biker yelped in pain, dropping to his knees as Jack released him and stepped back. The townspeople gasped, and even the bikers seemed taken aback by the speed and precision of Jack's movements. Red's face turned a deep shade of red, his hands clenching into fists. But before he could act, Jack spoke again. "This isn't a fight you're going to win," Jack said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You came here thinking you could intimidate this town, but all you've done is show us who you really are. It's over, Red. Walk away while you still can." Red's eyes darted around, taking in the defiant faces of the townspeople and the calm determination in Jack's stance. For a moment, it seemed like he might push forward anyway, but then he let out a frustrated growl and turned toward his bike. "Let's go," he barked at his crew. "This place isn't worth it." The bikers hesitated, but one by one, they followed Red's lead, climbing onto their motorcycles. The engines roared to life, and within moments, they were gone, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. As the sound of the bikes faded, the tension in the air dissipated. The townspeople erupted into cheers, their relief and gratitude evident in their smiles and applause. Jack turned to face them, offering a small nod of acknowledgement before heading back to his truck. He didn't need the accolades or the attention. All that mattered was that Millfield was safe, for now. But Jack knew this wasn't the end. Trouble had a way of circling back, and when it did, he'd be ready. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of peace, the weight of responsibility momentarily lifted as the town rallied behind him. The sun had just begun to set over Millfield, casting a warm, golden glow across the town. The tension from the confrontation earlier that day lingered like the last notes of a song, but the atmosphere was one of quiet relief. The bikers were gone, at least for now, and the townspeople were starting to believe that perhaps they could reclaim their peace. Jack Turner, however, wasn't one to let his guard down so easily. As Jack drove back to the farm, his thoughts churned with the day's events. The encounter with Red and his gang had gone as well as it could have, but Jack knew it wasn't over. Men like Red didn't just walk away and forget. They regrouped, strategized, and came back with something to prove. Jack had seen it too many times in the field. Retaliation was a dangerous game, and it often came at unexpected moments. When Jack pulled into the driveway, the familiar sights of home did little to ease his restlessness. His parents' house stood sturdy and warm, the porch light casting a comforting glow. Inside, his mother was preparing dinner, and his father was likely finishing up some paperwork. Jack parked the truck, stepping out into the cool evening air and letting the stillness of the farm ground him. But even as he inhaled deeply, his instincts told him to stay sharp. As he walked toward the house, he noticed something off. A faint glint of light caught his eye near the edge of the property, by the tree line. Jack paused, narrowing his eyes. He'd been around enough surveillance and covert operations to recognize the glimmer of binoculars. Someone was watching. Jack didn't react outwardly. Instead, he continued toward the house at the same pace, his mind racing. The bikers weren't gone, they were keeping tabs. Red must have sent someone to gather intel or possibly intimidate him further. Jack's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had a plan for this kind of scenario, and it was time to put it into action. Inside the house, his mother greeted him with a smile, her hands dusted with flour. "You're just in time, Jack. Dinner's almost ready." Jack kissed her cheek and smiled back, masking his concern. "Thanks, Mom. I'm just going to grab something from the barn real quick." He walked through the kitchen to the back door, his father glancing up from the dining table with a questioning look. "Everything all right, son?" Jack nodded. "Yeah, just something I need to check on." Out in the barn, Jack moved quickly and quietly. He'd always kept certain supplies on hand, a habit from his military days. In a corner of the barn, hidden behind a stack of hay bales, was a locked metal trunk. Jack crouched down, unlocked it, and lifted the lid to reveal an assortment of gear, nothing overtly lethal, but enough to give him an advantage if things escalated. He grabbed a pair of night vision goggles, a tactical flashlight, and a sturdy utility knife. He also pulled out a small handheld radio, one he'd given to Pete for emergencies. Jack clicked it on and spoke in a low voice. "Pete, you there?" A moment later, Pete's voice crackled through the speaker. "Yeah, I'm here. What's up?" "Keep your eyes open tonight," Jack said. "I've got a feeling the bikers are hanging around. Just spotted someone near the tree line on my property." There was a pause, then Pete's voice came back, tense. "You think they're planning something?" "Could be," Jack replied. "But I don't want to jump to conclusions. Just stay alert." "Got it," Pete said. "You need backup?" "Not yet," Jack said. "But I'll let you know." Jack ended the call and slipped the radio into his jacket pocket. He moved to the side of the barn, scanning the tree line with the night vision goggles. Sure enough, the faint outline of a figure was visible, crouched low among the trees. Jack's pulse quickened, but his movements remained controlled. He'd been in situations like this before, and he knew the value of patience. As the figure moved slightly, Jack noted the direction they were facing, toward the house. His parents were inside, completely unaware of the potential threat just beyond their property line. The thought sent a surge of protective resolve through him. He wasn't about to let these men bring their games to his family's doorstep. Jack slipped around the side of the barn, using the shadows for cover as he approached the tree line from an angle. The figure was focused on the house, giving Jack the advantage. When he was close enough, he stepped out of the shadows, the tactical flashlight in his hand blazing to life and illuminating the intruder. The man, a wiry, rough-looking biker, shielded his eyes, cursing under his breath. "What the hell?" he snarled, stumbling backward. Jack's voice was cold and steady. "You've got 10 seconds to tell me what you're doing on my property before I call the sheriff." The biker recovered quickly, his bravado returning as he realized Jack was alone. "Just taking a look around," he said with a smirk. "Nice place you got here." Jack took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "You're trespassing. Leave. Now." The biker sneered, but something in Jack's tone, or perhaps the sharp edge of the utility knife glinting in his hand, made him think twice. He raised his hands in mock surrender and began backing away. All right, the biker said. "No need to get worked up." Jack didn't lower the flashlight or the knife until the man disappeared into the trees. Only then did he allow himself to exhale, his grip relaxing slightly. But he knew this was just a test. The bikers were probing, trying to see how far they could push him. Tonight had been a warning, but Jack had no doubt they'd be back, and in greater numbers. He returned to the house, locking the doors and windows as a precaution. His parents noticed his seriousness but didn't press him for details, trusting that Jack would handle whatever was troubling him. That night, Jack stayed up, sitting by the window with the night vision goggles in hand. He didn't sleep, his senses attuned to every sound and movement outside. The next morning, Jack met with Pete, Sarah, and Ben to update them on what had happened. They discussed the possibility of organizing night patrols and setting up additional security measures around the town. The townspeople had shown their unity during the day, but they needed to be just as vigilant at night. Jack also made a discreet call to Sheriff Grady, informing him of the incident. The sheriff promised to increase patrols in the area, but Jack could hear the frustration in his voice. Millfield's law enforcement was stretched thin, and the bikers knew it. As the days passed, Jack continued to prepare. He reinforced the fences around the farm, installed motion-activated lights, and set up a network of cameras. He also trained a few trusted friends in basic self-defense techniques, sharing some of the skills he'd learned in the SEALs. The goal wasn't to incite violence but to ensure that if the bikers came back, Millfield would be ready. The community's resolve remained strong, but the tension grew with each passing day. The bikers had gone quiet, which was almost more unsettling than their overt aggression. Jack knew they were planning something, it was just a matter of when and where. Late one night, as Jack sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, he watched the stars overhead and thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. He'd come back to Millfield seeking peace, a chance to reconnect with the simpler life he'd left behind. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and Jack had learned to face them head-on. The bikers might have thought they could intimidate Millfield, but they didn't understand the strength of its people, or the quiet determination of a man who'd already faced the worst the world had to offer. Jack wasn't just fighting for his family or his farm, he was fighting for a town that had given him everything, a place worth protecting at all costs. As the night deepened, Jack's resolve hardened. Whatever was coming, he'd be ready. The calm that had settled over Millfield was a fragile one, like the stillness before a storm. Jack knew it wasn't a matter of if the bikers would return, but when. He'd spent the days since the trespassing incident doubling down on preparations, both on the farm and in town. The community had rallied behind him, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Every creak of a floorboard or distant growl of a motorcycle set hearts racing. Jack hadn't allowed himself to relax. The nights were the worst, filled with restless hours spent listening to the sounds of the countryside, his mind playing out every possible scenario. His military training had taught him to expect the unexpected, to anticipate the worst-case scenario and plan for it. But this wasn't a battlefield, it was his home. And that made everything more personal, more dangerous. It was on a particularly quiet Thursday evening that the storm finally broke. Jack was outside, finishing up repairs to a section of the barn roof that had been damaged in a recent windstorm. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of hay and earth. It was almost peaceful, until the distant roar of engines shattered the silence. Jack froze, his hammer clenched tightly in his hand. The sound grew louder, more distinct, as the unmistakable rumble of multiple motorcycles filled the air. He climbed down from the roof quickly, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. He reached into the barn for the handheld radio and keyed it on. "Pete, they're back," Jack said, his voice calm but urgent. "At least a dozen. Heading this way." Pete's voice crackled back almost immediately. "I hear them. We're ready. Do you need me to send anyone to the farm?" "Not yet," Jack replied. "Stay on standby. I'll handle it for now." Jack's parents came out onto the porch, concern etched on their faces. His father spoke first, his voice steady but worried. "Jack, what's going on?" "The bikers," Jack said simply. "They're coming." His mother's hand went to her mouth, but Jack stepped forward, his voice firm. I need you both to stay inside, lock the doors, and don't come out unless I tell you it's safe. Trust me." His father nodded, pulling his wife back toward the house. Jack watched them go, then turned back toward the driveway, where the sound of engines was now deafening. The first bike came into view, then another, until the entire gang had rolled up and lined their motorcycles in an imposing row. At the head of the group was Red, his expression a mixture of smugness and barely concealed rage. Red dismounted his bike, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. He stopped a few feet away from Jack, his gang forming a semicircle behind him. The men were armed with chains, bats, and crowbars, their intentions clear. "Evening, farmer boy," Red said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Heard you've been busy. Cameras, lights, training the locals. You think you're building some kind of fortress?" Jack stood his ground, his arms at his sides, his posture relaxed but ready. "I think I'm protecting what matters." Red laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent shivers through the air. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you when it's 12 against 1. Jack tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Red's. "You sure about that?" The question seemed to catch Red off guard, but he recovered quickly, his smirk returning. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Well, let me show you what happens to heroes." With a snap of his fingers, 2 of the bikers lunged forward, their chains swinging. Jack moved like lightning, sidestepping the first attack and grabbing the second man's wrist. He twisted sharply, forcing the biker to drop the chain with a yelp of pain. Jack followed through with a calculated strike to the man's knee, sending him to the ground. The first biker swung again, but Jack ducked, using the momentum to sweep the man's legs out from under him. Both attackers were down in seconds, groaning in pain. Jack straightened, his gaze fixed on Red. "Still think it's 12 against 1? Jack asked, his voice calm and steady. Red's smirk faltered, replaced by a scowl. "You're gonna regret that." The rest of the gang surged forward, a chaotic wave of aggression. Jack didn't back down. He moved with precision, using the bikers' own numbers against them. He dodged, deflected, and countered with the efficiency of a man who had faced far worse odds. Each strike was calculated, every move deliberate. But Jack knew he couldn't hold them off forever. Just as he began to feel the strain, a loud whistle cut through the chaos. Jack glanced up to see Pete and a group of townspeople charging down the driveway, armed with makeshift weapons, pitchforks, shovels, and wooden planks. They didn't hesitate, diving into the fray with a unity that spoke volumes about their resolve. The bikers, caught off guard by the sudden reinforcement, faltered. Jack took advantage of the confusion, taking down another attacker with a swift elbow to the ribs. The tide had turned, and the bikers began to realize they were outmatched. Red, seeing his men fall one by one, shouted a retreat. The gang scrambled for their bikes, their bravado replaced with panic. Within moments, they were gone, the roar of their engines fading into the distance. As the dust settled, the townspeople gathered around Jack, their faces a mixture of relief and awe. Pete clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder, grinning. "You really know how to put on a show, don't you?" Jack smiled faintly, his adrenaline still pumping. "Couldn't have done it without you." The group dispersed, some returning to town while others stayed to help Jack clean up. His parents emerged from the house, their expressions a mix of pride and concern. Jack reassured them with a hug, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was far from over. The bikers might have been driven off, but Jack knew they'd be back. Men like Red didn't take defeat lightly. But tonight, Millfield had stood its ground, and Jack had seen the strength of a united community. As he stood on the porch later that night, staring out into the darkened fields, Jack felt a sense of resolve settle over him. The fight wasn't over, but he wasn't alone. Millfield was his home, and he'd protect it with everything he had. Whatever came next, he was ready.